Greetings, everyone. Dr. Brian Scott with you. We are wrapping up another week. In fact, we're wrapping up another month. Today is Friday, May the 31st. It's hard to believe that we're 5 months into this 2024 year. Thank you for joining me on Insights to the End Times. We're looking at where we might be on God's timetable as we come to the end of the age. There's numerous scriptures that deal with this, and we've covered a lot of them over the last 2 or 3 years. This particular week, we are studying things that are happening in the world, and I've entitled each of the 3 sessions this week, Loss of Personal Freedoms. And the loss of personal freedoms is really part and parcel of the 7 years of tribulation that is coming. As we approach the end of the age, Jesus told us in Matthew 24 that we're not to know the time or the hour or the day that the end of the age comes upon us. Only the Father knows that. At the same time, he points out a whole bunch of signs that point towards the end. Things like deception, things like natural disasters. The Apostle Paul wrote a lot of the New Testament letters, and in those letters, he has warnings in many of them, particularly in the 2 letters he wrote to Timothy, who pastored the church, one of the very first churches in Ephesus. And in his letter to Timothy, he warned him of perilous times, exceedingly dangerous times. And when you study 2 Timothy chapter 3, the first 10, 12 verses, as he explains these perilous times, you'll find that every one of them is referring to how a man thinks, how he acts, what his thoughts are, what his objectives are, and they're not correct. They're very evil. They're very wicked. And that's why God sent the flood in the days of Noah to take out all of the evil, wicked people who had begun to operate on the earth. That's a whole nother study. But essentially, God said, I'm sorry I even made man, because they've become so evil, so wicked, and they are just full of evil intentions. We're at that same point. And in our sessions this week, in our 2 earlier podcasts this week, we were looking at the results of COVID-19 that came along in 2020, and the fact that it brought significant fear to the earth. But more importantly, the driving force behind this fear arose from a small group of individuals who seemed to have the puppet strings, and they were pulling the puppet strings all the time. We don't even know who they are. We don't know what their qualifications are, and we don't even know whether what they were sharing with us was right or wrong. In many cases, it had a semblance of truth, but it also had a massive semblance of fear. And if a person is operating in fear, they're not going to have strength like they otherwise would have. Physical, mental, emotional, social, spiritual, et cetera, et cetera. Then we were looking on Wednesday this week at this week's assembly of the World Health Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, and the proposal they have to bring in a new pandemic accord or a pandemic treaty, which they want every nation in the world that's part of the WHO, the WHO, to sign on to, which will give them complete authority and control over those nations. Now, I've seen 2 nations who have said no to it already. The United Kingdom has said no to this new pandemic accord. And then, I forget the name of the country, but their prime minister, there was an attempt to assassinate him this past weekend simply because he had said no to it as well. What other countries will say yes versus those who will say no? Unfortunately, it's going to have very, very overwhelming control features in our health system. During the pandemic, just one final point on that. We could go for a long time on that. In fact, I have a binder that's about that thick with articles that came out during the pandemic from all kinds of very, very highly respected, highly experienced medical specialists, particularly, who had a lot to say against the vaccination program, but they were always labeled as misinformers or conspiracy theorists or disinformers. It's amazing how easy it is to throw terms out when you don't want to discuss or get into the details. In any event, you may recall that if it was almost a foregone conclusion, if you're not vaccinated with their approved vaccinations, and if you haven't had all 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, you're not going to work for this company. You're not going to represent this company. You won't be allowed in here, there, or somewhere else. It's an issue of control. It's one world government. And today I want to look at this one world government theme that's occurring and highlight some of the things that I've come across. Now, I have been collecting, personally, I've been collecting newspaper articles that are written by editorial writers and by, newspaper writers who work for the newspapers. They vary in terms of their approach. Some are liberal, some are conservative, et cetera, et cetera. But I've been collecting these articles, and I must admit I've got 2 file folders that are about 2 inches thick over the last 2 years of articles that point out the fallacy of so many decisions being made by our governments and the impact of those decisions and the lack of rationale behind the decisions. It's like, we just think this is a good thing. We're going to force it down your throat, and you're going to have to live with it. And it doesn't have to make any sense. And it doesn't matter how much it costs, because we just print money, and you're the nation, the people, the population. You'll foot the bill over the next 100 years or so. Well, I know I'm generalizing, but I trust you know what I'm saying here. In any event, I want to share with you some trends that are developing here that are very, very serious trends. The first one, as we looked at the other day, is elitist decision makers who are they're the ones making these decisions. They're the ones making these proposals because they have come to the conclusion, we know more than everybody else. And some of these elitist members of society, they may know a great deal, but that doesn't necessarily give them the right to force what they think is best down my throat or your throat. That's called Antichrist, one world government mentality, and that's where the world's heading, and we're already seeing it occur. We saw it with the pandemic. A medical officer of health would say, this is what we're doing, and that was the way it was. And in many cases, those medical officers of health, they had things happening that were outside the boundaries of their authority that rewarded them for their directives. Well, that's not new. That's happened for centuries. Greed is always a motivating factor for many, many people. But let's look at a couple of other factors. Here's one where in our political system, we have elections. And in those elections, we review the platform of the individual who's running in our riding. We also review the platform of the national party or the provincial or the statewide party that they represent. And we vote accordingly, and we elect someone to represent us in government. But as soon as they're elected, what they may have said when they were campaigning, that they believe in, that they support, that they will enforce, it's lost. Because as soon as they are elected and they get down to the capital, wherever that happens to be, they are told, you will toe the party line no matter what. Your personal opinion does not have any say here whatsoever. Our position is non-negotiable. You will follow our mandate. And when I see the decisions that are coming out of our government officers and offices, and I think of the local representatives that we have voted for and elected, I can't even comprehend how can they support this. This is absolutely ludicrous. How can they support this? Well, they have no say. They have become token representatives. This is a new system that is really, really becoming very strongly enforced, maybe more so than it ever has in the past. And solely because our government mentality is we know best, we know better, we're going to be the ones in charge. In the United States, it's written and referred to from time to time. I don't have any personal knowledge of this. I just have read about it, heard about it. But they say the elected individuals who are coming to the Capitol, they're going to work hard to change things, and they're going to drain the swamp. And the swamp is a reference to all of the backroom offices and bureaucrats and so on who essentially steer the ship. I suspect, in fact, I've read very clearly here in our Canadian system that is exactly what occurs, and that the elected individuals have very little input, unfortunately. But the trend is the government knows best. The government will decide. The government will tell you what to do. These are forerunners of the Antichrist and his one world government that he will bring into effect as soon as the 7-year tribulation period begins, which could be any time now. Here's another one. The government, once again, they are of the opinion that more government's better than less government. So everything is now government-oriented. Every decision is government-oriented. They know more about everything. One of my fathers in the faith, spiritually speaking, was Dr. Edwin Lewis Cole. He had a ministry to men called the Christian Men's Network that went around the world. And I was fortunate enough to be associated with the ministry here in Canada for about a 14-year period. And I remember Dr. Cole making what we called one-line statements. We termed them Coleisms. And I remember him saying that where there's a lot of love, there's a little need for law. But where there's a lack of love, there has to be a lot of law. Well, we have laws for everything. We have laws that absolutely cover every area of our life. And it's just absolutely overwhelming. So the government's attitude is, hey, we're the best ones to make decisions about what you should and should not do, and that's the way it's going to be. So let me give you one quick example. When I was growing up in our small town, it was a town of about 1,000 people. We had a couple of car dealerships. My dad was a car dealer. He was actually a Ford dealer. And so was my grandfather. And we had a choice in those days when I was just a kid. And of course, my exposure was to our small town, what was going on there. So here was the deal. You could buy a Ford, or you could buy a Chevrolet, or you could buy a Dodge, or you could buy a Studebaker. Like we had 4 different car dealers. Now, if you bought a Ford, you might buy a Mercury. If you went to the Chevy dealer, you might buy a Buick or an Oldsmobile. If you went to the Dodge dealer, you might buy a Plymouth or a Chrysler. But the point was, limited number of brands, amen, all very similar. Now, over the years, of course, we now have all kinds of brands. We have all kinds of car companies. We have all kinds of SUVs. We just have a plethora of choices. That's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. But the government says, no, it's not a good thing. Here's the good thing. All these vehicles need to be electric vehicles because we got to save the planet. So now the government says, you're not choosing electric vehicles fast enough, so we'll help you. Here are the new rules. By 2026 in Canada, 20% of all the new car sales must be electrified vehicles. They call them EVs. By 2030, that's not all that long from now. This is 2024. That's only like 6.5 years. 60% of all vehicles must be EVs. And by 2035, 100% of all vehicles must be EVs. Well, what if you don't want to drive one? You don't have a choice because the government knows best, and they're saying this is the way it's going to be. So the key is that more government is better than less government. Once again, it sounds like I'm really, really coming hard against the government. What I'm coming hard against is this is a symbol. This is a trend that's taking us towards the one world government of the Antichrist. We're getting very, very close because it's impacting almost every area. You know, our government has decided plastic bags are no good anymore. They've decided plastic bottles are no good anymore. My wife picked up some fast food the other night for a change, and there were these 2 little bamboo forks because a plastic fork is not good for the environment. And they should know best because they are the government. Let me give you one last one. Hopefully we can get it all in. But the world, as I mentioned on Wednesday, is leaning towards authoritarian, totalitarian governments. We're seeing this happen in major countries like Russia and China and North Korea and so on. Turkey, Iran, these are dictatorial type settings. These are authoritarian type settings. Well, let me share some thoughts here from a book I've been reading. The book is entitled Foreshadows. It's by Steve Miller. It's a very, very comprehensive book on things that are foreshadowing the coming of the Antichrist and the end of the age. Steve Miller lists 13 key points that lead to totalitarianism. Here's what he shares. People are expected to adhere strictly to a single ideology, which happens to be the views of the ruling party. Secondly, the state reigns supreme over the individual person. Thirdly, the government is ruled by one party that demands all of its ruling representatives walk in lockstep. Fourthly, a dynamic and powerful leader stands as a symbol of the entire government. Fifthly, unconditional loyalty and uncritical support are demanded. Next, people are called to sacrifice self for the good of the state. Next, individual or basic liberties are denied. Mandates are used to demand submission. We've just experienced this. Compliance is achieved through government bodies that crush any form of opposition. Indoctrination, censorship, and persecution are used to enforce conformity. Wow. Number 11, the state regulates and controls all areas of your life, including education, labor, business, and the family. 12, the state strictly regulates media outlets to the point they are propaganda mouthpieces. And lastly, groupthink is enforced through censorship and social control. Now, these 13 points, you should probably listen to this podcast again. These 13 points, almost all of these things are occurring at the government level in our nation, our neighboring nation, and many other nations of the world. Why? These trends for a one-world government. These are trends of the Antichrist. This is This is Antichrist in training session time frame. Amen. It's like, hey, we're getting ready for the Antichrist during the tribulation period, so let's start training for him now. And this is exactly what is occurring. The people who are enforcing these rules and regulations, they think they're doing what's best. But Jesus said, beware of deception. Beware of false prophets. Beware of false teachers. Beware of false Christs. He was saying deception is going to be at an all-time high. This is one of the major signs of the last days, the tribulation period beginning. So in closing, I hope this has touched a few nerves to make you aware that we are getting closer and closer, because these things are already occurring. I'll see you next month. That's the month of June. Have a great weekend. Amen.